Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
Most of us come out of training and have no idea on how to balance a busy clinical practice, academic interests, and most importantly, our home and personal lives. Mr. Adi Kumar is trying to change all that. Mr. Kumar is a consultant neurosurgeon in the UK and has written a book called Work Less, Live More, The Doctor's Guide for Time Freedom. We caught up with him to talk about his somewhat unconventional academic interests and his thoughts on how we as physicians can lead more fulfilling lives. Make sure to check out the links to his Twitter profile, his newsletter, and his latest effort, doctorsandwriters.com.
So, Dr. Kumar, thank you so much for joining us on the Cold Steel Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. Can you maybe introduce yourselves a little bit to our audience and tell us about where you grew up and where you did your training?
Thanks for having me. My name's Adi Kumar. I'm a neurosurgeon working in the National Health Service in the UK. Born in the UK, raised in Yorkshire, which is a county in the north of England. Did all my schooling there, went down south to Cambridge University and University of London to do my medical degree. Came back up home for a little while to cut my teeth, as they say, first few years as a doctor. And then after 3 years, I got my neurosurgery training position. And that took me even further north across the border up into Scotland in Glasgow, where I am now. Been here since 2014, 10 years goes very quick. I did all my training, did my school-based fellowship, what I specialize in. And as they say, that you don't know what the future brings. So I'm going way back down south again, right to the south of England, down to Plymouth to take up another consultant job later this year. So that's a snapshot of me, I guess.
That's a really neat pathway. What does your clinical practice look like these days, both in terms of content and volume and structure?
I'd say content is predominantly specializing in skull-based pathology. So that's predominantly pituitary disease endoscopically, and also lateral approaches to the skull-based vestibular schwannoma and meningiomas. But there's also neurosurgery similar to general and trauma. There's a lot of on-call emergency work, which takes up about half of the practice. So there's on-call work, which involves, a wide range of pathologies, including training juniors throughout the whole process. And on a normal week, it'd be 2 operating lists, a clinic, maybe 1 on-call. And in the future, that'll just change a little bit. I'm going to niche down a bit more with the lateral skull-based work and do a bit less endoscopy in the future. That's kind of like a broad overview of working pattern for me.
Super interesting. We're really excited to talk to you today because you've clearly developed a relatively large footprint and some important, but maybe you could say non-traditional academic interests, YouTube, X, Twitter, and so on. How did you develop those interests? How did that kind of come to your life and your trajectory?
It's one of those things where you have a curiosity and you just need the right spark to kind of kick it off. And for me, YouTube was the first thing. And I guess the spark was another person, a surgeon called Mohammed Draz, who's a neurosurgeon working in the UK. We're working together and we're both on the same kind of wavelength with regards to wanting to create things and like kind of tech and the way that medicine's going. We didn't know it, but independently both had wanted to start a YouTube channel just to educate people, because I spoke with some orthopedic surgeons recently. They invited me to talk at one of their conferences. One of my slides was of a neurosurgeon. It was a bit of a cartoon, like this is what an old neurosurgeon looked like. It was like a wizard, basically. Just a bit of a joke. People were laughing because they don't see neurosurgeons, because we're a tertiary center. Every patient that needs to be treated comes to us. And so Mohammed and I wanted to demystify neurosurgery a bit for doctors, but also for patients. And just do simple stuff like, this is what your operating theatre will look like. And a lot of people started to comment and say it was really helpful to know where I would be going to be put under general anesthetic and things that we take for granted. So that's how the YouTube started. At the same time, I realized that I just really enjoyed creating things and mainly educating people. And I had written a blog back in 2013, 14, because I enjoyed writing. And I said, I'm going to pick that back up, but I've got a bit of experience. I've made a few mistakes. I don't mind sharing those mistakes with other people so that they don't make them, especially when it comes to patient care. And so I started to write on Twitter. And then I learned and realized that I really do enjoy writing. And like anything, same as surgery, there's so much space to improve and make your craft a little bit better with time. And I've just carried on basically.
Yeah, you've really taken that interest in writing and the work that you did on Twitter and took much of that work and translated it into a book, which I'd highly recommend for all our listeners. It's called Work Less, Live More, and you can get it as an ebook. And we'll have all the links in the show notes. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that book? And we really want to delve a little bit deep about the content, obviously without giving away too much of what you've talked about. So tell us a little bit about where the genesis of the ideas for that book came from.
A few things happened at the same time. So at the end of my training, life happens outside of work. You get married, you have kids, you have more responsibility at home as well as at work. People demand more of you. And I was feeling that going through that process of my life. And I wanted to figure out, how can I use my time most effectively so I fulfill my responsibilities at work and at home? And so I kind of went pretty far down the rabbit hole of reading productivity books. And I don't know in Canada, but if they know about a person called Ali Abdaal's pretty famous YouTuber, ex-doctor, so read some of his stuff and picked up all these little bits and pieces on how to use my time effectively. But there's a big thing that no one talks about in productivity is that the better you get, the better you better get. It's a phrase, and it means that when you get good at something, people notice. They ask you to do more stuff, and you say yes because most people like to help other people, especially if they're in healthcare. And so I was doing more and more kind of on this rabbit wheel, and I just burnt myself out fairly quickly over a year or two. And I realized, I ended up a trip to an accident, an emergency with arrhythmias. I was just exhausted. Thankfully, everything was fine. At a similar time, the person who made me want to become a neurosurgeon very unexpectedly took his own life, and he was a massive success. He had, you saw him from the outside, and everything was something to aspire for, but something wasn't right. And I thought at that point, I really have to do something if I'm going to have a long and healthy career that will, be able to be run in the long term. So I realized all the productivity gurus, none of them were doctors. None of them talked about how to look after themselves. None of them talked about how to use productivity as a tool to fulfill your responsibilities. Also use that free time that you create to then invest in yourself and look after yourself. And so I put everything together. I started writing about it on Twitter and X, and then slowly people started to comment more and get in touch with me. And I realized I could just condense this into a book. And again, to stop people from making my mistakes and make the most of their time, but also use the free time that they generate to look after themselves.
It's really interesting that you felt the need to write something specifically for medics or for physicians. When you think about the plethora of other self-help productivity type books, and you actually have a few really good references at the end of the book of, I think, things that have helped you. Like it's interesting that you wrote something specifically targeted to physicians, and you've touched about it a little bit. What do you think makes our lives different than perhaps other busy professionals, and why did you feel that you needed to have something targeted for medicine?
I guess there's a few factors that make our lives different compared to other professions. One would be the unpredictable nature of our work. And that would range from, I guess, more scheduled, like general practice, or I think it's family physician in Canada and the US, to something more like a trauma surgeon or a general surgeon, which can be very unpredictable. And so there can be a lot of plans made, but they all have to go out the window very quickly. And that can cause anxiety and stress in this bucket of stuff that never gets done, but is important because you're always putting out fires. Another way that it's different, and it's no criticism of the way that we're educated, but we're very structured and routine in our education, especially training as a surgeon. And it has to be. You have to meet certain milestones to show your competency and safety as a surgeon. Then you get very used to not questioning, is there another way to do things? You get very used to kind of having a goal given to you and then you go and achieve it. But I found, at least, I wasn't that good at thinking outside the box and directing how I use my own time. Once you no longer have people setting targets for you, you get to set your own schedule and you feel like you have to prove yourself again. And so you pack it full instead of realizing that this is very much a marathon that you want to see to the end and not a short burst or a sprint. So those are probably two ways. I could go on for a long time, but there's probably two ways how our job's very different.
I resonate with that so much as a new attending as well, that really you basically try to model yourself off people that you've seen or people that you admire, but that might not work for you. Those might not be your dreams, or those might not be how you want to live your life. So those are really astute things. And the piece about just the unpredictability of it, right? All of our families know that we might say we might be home at a certain time, but it's like what Mike Tyson said, like everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And so that's how I often feel sometimes about my life and my schedule sometimes. I don't want to give away too much from the book because I really do think our listeners should go away and read it. But there are a few things that really struck me. One of the chapters that I really liked was the 168 hours chapter. A little bit about what you talked about in that chapter and what you kind of advocate in terms of trying to map out what your life looks like.
I got this idea from an author called Laura Vanderkam, who wrote a book of the name 168 Hours. And it just reframed the way I think about time in an important way. So 168 hours comes from 7 days a week, 24 hours in a day. And that's the time everyone gets. But it seems like some people achieve so much in that same time period. And I felt anyway, I was kind of spinning my wheels and not kind of covering all my bases. And so you look at it, you have 168 hour blocks, 168 blocks of time in a week, and you get to choose how you use that time. And a lot of it goes on things that you have to do, like sleep, look after yourself, look after your family, go to work, but only by actually looking how you're spending your time. So in the book, I talk about doing a very simple time audit and then reassessing or reflecting on it and saying, you know what, I actually spent a lot more time commuting than I thought. I spent more time on phone calls or meetings, but they didn't actually produce much than I thought. How can I move these blocks around so that I am using them intentionally? And the most important aspect of that from a big picture, it makes you realize that there's a finite amount of time. You're not going to get everything done that you want to do. People say one of the most important things about being productive or saving time is learning to say no, which I agree is important. You do have to say no to certain things. The kind of challenging thing that I'm coming to terms with now is not only do you have to say no to things that you don't think are important to you or useful, you also have to say no to things that you do want to do, you do think are important, and realize that, you've got a certain amount of time and some of the things you really want to do, you're just not going to be able to do. And that's an act of bravery in a way to say, you know what, I'm going to categorize all these things are important, and this is the thing that I'm going to choose to work on and use my time intentionally. And so it really opens up the idea of opportunity cost. Choosing to do one thing is actually choosing not to do 100 or 1,000 other things. So really think about how you spend your time, and then you'll feel good when you have had that kind of difficult process. At the end of it, you will realize, I spent my time doing something that I really wanted to do.
Yeah, there's a real sense of an intentionality that you're talking about in the book. And I think that's like a through line that goes throughout the book, is having a sense of intentionality about what you're doing and how you spend your time, which, surprisingly doesn't come necessarily intuitively to physicians, because we just sort of have to deal with what comes in through the door, so to speak. And so in some sense, you don't develop that intentionality piece of like, okay, how do I really want to spend my time, or what do I really want to do with my life? And I'm going to circle back to that in a second. But one other thing I really enjoyed from the book was, talking about the cold you and the hot you. And I like that for two reasons. One is that, again, it references good old Danny Kahneman, who I think, if you haven't read his book, everybody should go read it. But also, I love the way that you frame that in terms of medicine, and some of the pictures and the examples that you use in the book are really great. But can you talk a little bit about this concept of the cold you and the hot future you?
I realized I was getting quite frustrated that I got really good at planning, but not so very good at doing the plans. partly because work was so unpredictable. But I realized that, when I was sat at home, I do all my planning on like a Sunday or a day I have free, have all these things that I want to do, and it looks fine on paper. But when rubber meets the road, it doesn't pan out like that. And I was like, where's the disparity or disconnect? And I realized that when you're sat at home, well rested and fed and in a calm environment, it's very easy to plan. That's kind of like cold thinking. But when it comes into doing something at work, or when you're quite tired after work and have stuff to do, looking after your family, your brain isn't in the same kind of headspace. Your processing isn't the same. You could be tired, you could be hungry, thirsty, a bit stressed. And so doing something which on paper was very simple when you wrote it down becomes quite challenging. And so I realized that the person I'm planning for, the person I'm going to get to do these things is going to be a bit different to the person who's planning them. And so I want to make future me, is how I write in the books, life as easy as possible. And so I kind of outline a few simple ways to make executing plans as easy as writing the plans in the first place.
I think that was fabulous. The last thing I kind of want to touch on specifically for the book is, at the very end, you kind of talk about the fact, this paradox that the better that you get, the more you have to do and the more you're given. What are your thoughts on how to become more intentional with how we use our time? Because I think one of the things I always struggle with when I read any of these productivity type books is that there's a lot of discussion perhaps about how you can organize your time or plan your time. But I sometimes feel like there's less discussion about how people find their purpose and how people find what really rings true to them. And obviously that this is the big topic and not something I expect you to be able to solve for us in a half an hour podcast, when philosophers and people throughout the ages have been trying to sort out this kind of question. But for Mr. Kumar, what sort of advice rings true?
I'd say that you have to figure out your values, what is actually important to you. And similar to the book, I'm all about, it's easy to give, platitudes like I just have, but it's more useful to give concrete steps how to do that. The first place I'd go is where I picked up the idea was a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think it's by Stephen Covey, who I think's passed away now. But in his book, there's a chapter where it sounds corny. I'll say it, but he says, write out your own personal constitution, similar to the US Constitution, but you write down what's actually important to you. And these became really concrete for me. Actually, when I had to go for consultant job interviews, it was the first time in my life that I actually wrote down my values, because they may ask you in an interview, what are your values? How do they fit with our department? So you really have to do some reflection. It's not actually very easy. But things like, working hard, it's been inculcated in me from my parents as a child. Fulfilling your potential because other people don't have the same opportunities as you, or standing up for injustice if you think that you're in a position where you have a voice for people who don't. There's things that are all personal to us. And so write out a few of these things and just put it on a Word document on your laptop that you read every so often. And something that I'd written down is people before things. And, people before things is just a simple line, but it means that the world is very quick and it's getting a lot faster. And there's so much information that comes into you as an individual on a day-to-day basis. And there's more information being created than we will ever, navigate. And if you have these principles written down, it's like a little heuristic that you could just come back to and be like, this is what I value. This is the situation. And I can kind of say, you know what, I'm going to look after people instead of going for things. It's very simple. Here's a shiny carrot. Do you want it? Actually, no, I want to spend time with my family. It's very straightforward. And doing a few of these steps, I think, is like an overarching map for you to kind of stick with your own constitution. So at the end of the day, if you follow what you've planned or written down that you believe is true, you'll be comfortable irrespective of the environment or how you have to act. I guess that's maybe a longer answer. Maybe some philosophers have said that in the past before.
No, that's perfect. And it makes so much sense when you frame it that way. One of the things that I think is clearly endemic to what we do is the physical nature, not only of medicine, but certainly of surgery, both in and out of the operating room and on call, as you pointed out. And really the entire framework of what we do is there's a physicality to it that's in many ways relatively unique within the medical context and certainly within the greater societal context of professionals. You've written a fair bit about specific techniques for maximizing energy and wakefulness. I'm curious if you could walk us through that, not only your thoughts, but how you then have mechanized that in your daily life.
Yeah, it comes back a bit to the unpredictable nature of our job. Everyone who went to medical school and a lot of other people would know that we have a natural circadian rhythm. And there's a person that operates on people's pituitary glands. Sometimes I upset that circadian rhythm, hopefully temporarily, but sometimes permanently, and it has massive fallout. And part of that is how your energy is maintained through a day. And so the way I've mechanized it in a way is just to make sure that I do what is very relatively simple things to reinforce that circadian rhythm, especially when it gets upset by waking up in the night, working long hours, or working during the night to try and bring it back to where it should be. And it's really simple stuff. I live in Glasgow, so there's not much sunlight. But if you can go outside for a walk in the morning, it's free. You move, you get some sunlight, even if it's cloudy. And these signals to your body that it's daytime, it's the morning, let's release some cortisol. It wakes you up. If you want to add on exercise, there's more cortisol added onto that. And cortisol gets a bad rap in a lot of blog posts and things. But trust me, if you take away someone's cortisol response, they die very quickly. And I've seen it surgically in the hospital. And so simple things like that, and training your rhythm of eating is another thing. And also temperature is very important in terms of your circadian rhythm. So at nighttime, your temperature drops. It's why you fall asleep. In the morning, it rises. It's why you wake up. And doing things, again, like exercise, going outside, just to reinforce these basic rhythms is what I have found has been the most useful thing to maximize my energy, but also my cognition. And that's how it linked to work, because it's very clear when you're tired, you don't make very good decisions. And decision making is the core of not only being a surgeon, but also a doctor and physician. So those are a few ways that I just implement, making sure I've got as much focus and energy as I can have. It's not always enough, but as much as I can.
That's great advice. What other tools do you have in your tool belt, whether it's other physical things or supplements or really anything else that you utilize on a regular basis?
So pretty much daily exercise is really important to me. So it's physically and mentally, it wakes me up better than anything. I'm a big proponent recently in the last few years of cold exposure, which isn't difficult in Glasgow, but actually getting in some cold water most days actually wakes me up a lot and is good for mental health, and has also been shown to help with depression quite recently. Supplements, I used to be really deep into supplements, things like alpha GPC, which is a form of choline, which is used to create neurotransmitters in your brain. I used to take before work, kind of intense work or revision bouts. But I've started to kind of move towards just trying to hit these very basic things of exercise, adequate sleep, waking up without an alarm clock as much as possible, but that's difficult. Going to bed when I'm actually tired instead of saying I'm going to do another hour's work, because the hour isn't as productive as half an hour when I'm actually well rested. So I've decided more to move towards hitting those core tenets than adding on the supplements. And I think the supplements can be useful, but they're called supplements for a reason. They supplement the foundation of doing these basic things that people don't talk about very much because they can't sell you things as a tail thing.
Yeah, drink this tea and your life will be better, right?
Yeah.
What you just said is very, very true. One of the things you also do, among the millions of other things that you do, is write a newsletter. And again, we'll put a link in the show notes for that as well too. One of my favorite posts that you've written, that you shared on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, is called "Why Being Surgeon is a Poser's Gamble," and or a Loser's Gamble. Can you tell us about what you meant by surgery as being a loser's gamble?
Yeah, so I think there's so many things that we can learn from outside of medicine and bring it back to being doctors. And it comes back to the very structured nature of our training. So I've read a book, I think it's called Extraordinary Tennis for the Ordinary Tennis Player. I'm not a tennis player, but there must be something about tennis because there's another great book called The Inner Game of Tennis, I think by Nick Galloway. In the first book I mentioned, there's this idea that I don't know if either of you guys play tennis. I don't play tennis, but if we picked up a racket, the person who would win our game, we're novices, would be the person who makes the least mistakes. So ours game is the loser's game. The one who makes the least mistakes will be the winner. And then you get to the next level. You get the Roger Federers, the Nadals, the Venus Williams. They are playing a different game. They're playing a winner's game. It's not going to be the person who makes the least mistakes who wins their game. It's going to be the person who hits the most outstanding, amazing shots. And this clicked in my head. I was like, this is something I see now. I train surgeons, and I did myself all the time. When you start out learning a craft, for some reason, it must be a part of human nature. You want to stand out and prove that, I am good enough to be a surgeon. So you want to do amazing things. Whereas actually what you want to be doing is not making mistakes. And you want to be doing that for much longer than you think. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, until you no longer make mistakes. You can go through whatever the skill set you're learning. And then once you've got an overall skill set, you then transition, and it's probably when you become a consultant or independent practitioner, to the winner's game in this analogy. Now you no longer make mistakes. If you make mistakes, you realize it, you fix them very quickly. If you want to progress personally, you need to start moving into different arenas and starting to do things that make you stand out, or new goals for yourself that give you a sense of achievement. And I see a big problem, not a problem, but a repetitive kind of cycle of people who are learning something. They see the people that they want to become and want to do outstanding things like them. And that's the wrong map. That's the wrong reality. They should focus on not making mistakes to become like that person in the future. It came to me and I thought, I can't condense this down very much into Twitter, and it went into a newsletter article.
That's absolutely fantastic. And, I can only speak for myself, but I wasn't aware of that book, but it sounds great. And, we're certainly going to encourage our listeners to review it as well. But curious, you're such a thoughtful, well-spoken, really original thinker, and clearly very hard worker in neurosurgery and your family and your life. What's next for you? What are your vision? What are your goals? Where do you want to head next?
Thank you very much. It's nice of you to say. I guess in the immediate future, I'm going to be in a new position as a consultant. So first few years will be just getting my feet set, looking after my patients, having a safe practice. Beyond that, outside of work, my kids will be starting school. That'll be a big transition. Want to make sure I'm around as much as possible for my oldest daughter to navigate that. And then personally, I can really see the power of writing for doctors, of being able to do it for themselves, to reflect on what is a very difficult job. I think writing can allow you to process emotions, tackle uncertainty when you're looking after patients. If you then go on to share what you've had in your reflections, it can help not only other patients, but people who will become patients in the future when they read it, to see that someone has been through this same process and see it from the physicians and doctors' side. And so I'm going to very shortly, I don't know when this will air, I'm founding a company called Doctors and Writers, which will allow doctors to kind of get to grips with the writing process for whatever means, as well as helping health companies write better narrative to help patients. In the long future, this is probably outside the realm of healthcare or anything, but I guess it's the point of why you got me on here. I see that there is a very clear trend towards condensing very complex topics into short snippets, which is ironic for someone who writes on Twitter a lot, or X. And it's why I wrote a newsletter and why I enjoy doing these podcasts. I think I'm going to try, maybe for the rest of my career or life, to try and bring back the emphasis on long form conversation between people to be able to come from opposing viewpoints, have a constructive conversation. And I think that would encourage, at least I think it would set an example for my kids to see that the world is very complicated. People are very different. And the way that these differences or complicated situations can at least become slightly untangled is by being able to have a constructive conversation and not to jump to conclusions, and see that that's very much possible, because I don't see a huge amount of it these days anymore.
Yeah, all you have to do is turn on the news for a second to see how difficult that has become. And ironically, things like ChatGPT is only going to make that challenge of dealing with complex topics more difficult in some ways. Like you lose all the nuances with those types of platforms. But in any case, that sounds amazing and fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. We can't thank you enough. One of the things we ask all our guests is, if you could go back in time and give yourself advice, you're just starting out your consultant career. So I'll ask you a slightly different version of this question. If you could go back in time and give yourself advice just when you were starting out in training, what advice would you give yourself?
I'd remind myself that this is all temporary, and say that it applies to the good times, which thankfully there've been a lot of, or will be a lot of, and really enjoy those, really hold on to it, enjoy the process. And also it applies to the tough times, because they don't last for long, and they never last as long as you think they will. So it's all quite temporary, and you should not be so focused on the future. Just enjoy what's going on now, because a lot of things get tougher.
This too shall pass. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.